Here it is, the most sweeping agreement on tariffs and trades in 40 years has been passed by the Senate of the United States. It was called GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs, and I want you to notice something that is said here. It was passed by 76 to 24 vote in the Senate, and many of those votes were lame duck votes. To me, it's one of the most significant pieces of legislation in this century, because it establishes, basically, it establishes the first major step toward world government. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me this incredible event.
Well, JR, what we have is the establishment of a global bureaucracy. Or maybe another way to say it would be a global government in its kind of a skeleton form. No one really knows what's going to happen, and that's the problem. As a matter of fact, this thing is still in its formative stages, but JR, there is a kind of a dream in the minds of leaders, and it's been there for a long time, namely that if we can just get this world set up on a global footing with a kind of an international government of some sort, we can stop wars, we can control economies, and we can create a kind of a paradise on earth. That's really what's at the root of all this.
All we have to do, Gary, is go back and look at the progression of the United States of Europe, how it came together. In the late 1940s, beginning after World War II, European politicians began to get together. 6 countries decided that they were going to eliminate tariffs and trade. Tariffs on trade. In 1948, they established the 6-nation European Economic Community. It all had to do with trade between the countries. And so they set up this, what was called a common market. Eventually, slowly, step by step, year after year, they passed this, they added this bureaucracy, that bureaucracy, until finally they were ready to put the political thing together. And Humpty Dumpty was put back together again, and they did it all over trade. This is exactly what is happening for world government today. They're moving slowly, step by step, preparing the nations for a political union. That's what I see. It's an incredible thing that is happening. And so you see, most people did not discuss the idea of world government. There were those who were for the GATT and those who were against the GATT. But nobody really discussed, you didn't hear this on the major news media. They're talking about world government.
Now, JR, there's something interesting about this. Really, this whole movement picked up speed or came into some kind of reality right at the turn of the century, starting in about 1900 and moving into World War I. Then the period between World Wars I and II. We saw financial manipulations on a global scale for the first time in human history. And we had international merchant bankers setting up global exchanges, handling money and energy policy. And this thing has matured, and we now come down to the last decade of the 20th century, and JR, the men who started way back at the beginning of this century believe that they have it within their grasp to form this long dreamed of global government.
Isn't it amazing, Gary, that the American public, voting for all those Republicans in November, were hoping to get some sanity restored to Washington, and yet what a slap in the face. When even some of those elected Republicans voted for GATT. That's incredible.
It is. It came through on a very rapid pace. They call it fast-track legislation. Well, JR, to me, the fast track was the wrong track. It needed to be discussed, and I think the people needed to know that, hey, what we're voting on here is global bureaucracy.
Yeah, listen to this. This is from the Daily Oklahoman, the section of the newspaper where they discussed views, letters to the editor, and so on. And it says right here that Section 742 of the GATT requires every newborn baby to be given an IRS taxpayer ID number.
Taxpayer ID.
Now, what's
number.
that doing in GATT, you know?
Yeah.
I thought it was a treaty simply to free the trade from between countries, you know, and get rid of the tariffs and the taxes.
Now, wait just one second, JR. I believe that's currently called a Social Security number, isn't it? But
in the United States it is, but this is a world agreement here. We're talking the whole world.
And now it's
124 nations.
It's no longer Social Security, it's Taxpayer ID.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
Fascinating.
Taxpayer ID.
Yeah.
And notice, please, this is the front page of the Daily Oklahoman, Friday, December 2nd, 1994. It says, Senate passes tariff-cutting world accord.
A world accord.
This idea of it being tariff-cutting is a bone thrown to the dog. Just, you know, to keep you happy, to think, well, look at there, that's going to be a wonderful thing. 22,000 pages, it has a lot more to do than with just cutting tariffs.
Indeed it does. It regulates the lives of citizens. JR, we've been talking literally for years about a system that would arise in the latter days, system of economic, financial control that is so finely tuned that it goes right down to each individual person. And that person has to have a number attached to his name. And what you just read reminds me a lot of what the Bible says.
You know, when I was a teenager, I was told that I needed to get a Social Security number before I could get a job.
Me too.
And it was not necessary for me to get a Social Security number, only if I wanted to get a job. And so here I was, a teenager, you know, and I went down, I applied for my Social Security number and got it. And the fascinating thing about it is, they have slowly been bringing that down to the crib, to babies. I remember my granddaughter that was born a little over a year ago now. The first 4 months or 6 months of her life, she didn't have to have a Social Security number. Her parents were able to take the deduction for the newborn baby, but the next year, that girl had to have a Social Security number before they could take a tax exemption on her. And now they bring it down to newborn, there it is, right there, just as big as life. The newborn baby's going to have a Social Security or what is called a tax ID number.
Wow.
Gary, the mark of the beast is moving on down the road. It's coming at us just as big as life.
And by the way, there's a whole contingent of people out here, perhaps the majority, who believe that we can create a better world by numbering everybody, by controlling the comings and goings, by controlling buying and selling. We can regulate, and we'll have peace and prosperity through this system. This is the common thought.
Yeah. Now, you know, Gary, let's go to Psalm 2. This, to me, is the most exciting part of it all, because Psalms 1 and 2 set the picture for this century. As you know from our book, Hidden Prophecies in the Psalms, we have discovered that the Psalms literally tell the story of this century, year by year, psalm by psalm, the year numbered according to the psalm. In Psalm 48, I think the prime example would be the birth of Israel in 1948 is described in Psalm number 48. And of course, the Psalms being the 19th book of the Old Testament, Book 19, chapter 48 tells the story of 1948. The numbers are there all the way through 1994 and Psalm 94. The important thing about this is Psalms 1 and 2 set the theme for the story to be told in the Psalms.
Yeah.
And of course, Psalm 1 tells about the rebirth of Israel under two metaphors, the birth of the baby and the replanting of the tree. That's all in Psalm 1. But Psalm 2 tells about world conditions during this last century, the century that would see the tribulation period and the coming of Christ to establish the kingdom of heaven. And Gary, that's what Psalm 2 gives us. It opens with, why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? Let's go to the Hebrew on that, Gary, and give us a basic overview of what the Hebrew writing of the original intent was on this verse.
And by the way, this is really good in the original language, JR. It so perfectly describes what's going on. Why do the heathen rage? The Hebrew word for heathen is goy, or goyim. and this is the common Jewish word for Gentiles. So we have here, why do the Gentiles rage? And that word rage, JR, is the Hebrew word that means a group of rumbling, raging people gathered together into a kind of a mob, or a kind of a tumultuous gathering. And if that doesn't describe
like
today's...
armies preparing to make war.
Yeah, armies preparing to make war, or maybe...
or a mob gathering in the street.
A mob gathering in the streets with torches. It's like everything is poised.
Wanting to lynch somebody.
Yeah, wanting to lynch somebody maybe. And what a picture.
I think we can see that in this century with World War I and World War II, with the other wars, the continual bloodletting across the face of the earth. Why do the Gentile nations make war? Rumbling together, moving together as one mob. The interesting thing is the next part of this sentence says, and the people imagine a vain thing. The word people here is different from the word heathen.
Yes, it is.
Now, the word heathen means Gentiles,
right.
But the word people, what does that refer to?
Well, the word people, it basically is a Hebrew word that means a group of people gathered under a common system of thought. The thing that brings them together is that they share a basic philosophy. So we have here a group of people who think up or dream up worthless plans that will come to absolutely nothing.
Vain thing.
Vain thing. Here we have a people whose commonality is that of an idea or a philosophy. And they have come together and said, oh, we've got a great idea if we can just bring this to pass.
Now, this has been actually the primary underlying basis of all political thought in this century. To get together, to have things in common. Now, in the early part of this century, it was called communism.
Yeah.
But basically, that's what it is. For everybody to have all things in common, basically, a global government.
And by the way, in educational institutions today, throughout the world, globalism is taught to young people. We're talking about kindergarten all the way up through college. The common thread of teaching is that of creating a global citizen, a one-world citizen, who is comfortable transcending international barriers, which are thought to be outmoded.
Okay, so we have here the Gentile nations are raging, making war, conflict continually, while the intellectuals, the people, that is those in governmental positions, imagine the idea of a commonality, a global government getting together. And it moves on to verse 2, says, the kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together. Gary, that to me really smacks of the organized attempts to create global government in this century.
And in this verse, JR, we have two classes of people. We have kings mentioned and we have rulers mentioned. The word for king is a Jewish Hebrew word that means self-appointed king, kind of. Not a king in line for the throne by his genetic heritage, but more or less a self-appointed king.
Or elected type
Perhaps,
king.
yeah. And then we have the word for ruler is the common word for lord, a lord being part of the landed gentry, the ultra-rich, shall we say. So we have two classes here, the self-appointed kings, politicians, and the ultra-rich. And what are they doing? Well, they are setting themselves. The kings of the earth set themselves. This is a term that means to dig in, if you will. Plant yourself. Take a position.
Determination.
Yeah, determination. Almost as though positioning yourself for battle. And the rulers, or the lords, take counsel together. And JR, you know what this means in Hebrew? It means secretly conspire together. In fact, the Hebrew word sod, which means secret, is in this sentence. The lords conspire together, secretly.
Incredible. You know, with the turn of the century, that's exactly what was happening with the rulers of the people, that is the super rich, the international banking cartel. They were getting together to establish their common goal for world government. And it's interesting that they take counsel together. You remember after World War I, the League of Nations? It was a short-lived entity because the United States politicians refused, at least the most of them, to take part in it. But the elite, the Wall Street bankers, Warburg and Kuhn Loeb Company, J.P. Morgan Company, Brown Brothers Harriman, all of those, and the Rockefeller clan, all of those were conspiring together secretly, along with Woodrow Wilson, to try to get the United States to join the League of Nations.
That's right.
And of course, it didn't come off. But by World War II, the United Nations was an accepted idea, and ever since has been conspiring for world government.
And we see today, what do we see? The control, for example, of the United States military policy has been taken right out of the hands of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's now controlled by the current head of the United Nations. At the moment, Boutros Ghali, making decisions about how U.S. troops are to be used in world confrontation. In other words, the fruit of this thing is the disintegration of nationalism, that is, a national identity. And this is exactly what those planners had in mind from day one.
Absolutely. Even, for example, there was communists among the people who in the mid-1940s put the United Nations together, and later were accused and convicted of being communist spies. These were the people who were the signers of the United Nations. Absolutely incredible. And we have here that they take counsel together against the Lord and against His anointed. Interesting word, that word anointed.
Oh, it's the word Mashiach, which means the Messiah, the Lord Jesus Christ. And you know, the Godhead, J.R., has a redemptive plan for this earth. The Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. According to the biblical view of history, they are in the process of redeeming this earth. Meanwhile, man rebels.
Yes. Not only do they want to establish world government, but they have an underlying satanic Luciferian reason for establishing world government. They want a government without God. They want a world without God. In fact, they say, let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. And to me, Gary, this is saying they are wanting to cast off the moral restraints taught by the Messiah. I think that's what the rabbis actually commented.
The Jewish commentary on this talks about really two kinds of rope here. Let us break their bands, let us cast away their cords. Bands is a Hebrew word for a small rope that you might wrap around somebody. That is, cords is a word for small rope. Bands is the word for a rope that is so heavy you can't cut it, and so you have to take it off. The idea, J.R., is that what we have here is the Hebrew word mosar, which is moral teaching, precept, the teaching of the Torah, the teaching of the Bible. And that word root, if you change the vowels and make it moser, means cords. So moral precepts are likened to cords in the Hebrew. Cords of discipline.
In other words, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not.
Yeah, they restrain. In other words, they restrain man from his natural sinful ways. And the picture here is very clear. These people wish to cut cords and cast off heavy ropes which have restrained them. And these are the moral precepts of the Bible.
Now, that means that the Bible is no longer welcome. And this is the underlying reason for the League of Nations and the United Nations. They want to enslave the human race and get rid of God.
That's right.
In fact, when you have the truth of the Bible, you have real freedom. When you get rid of the Bible, you get rid of freedom. And the opposite of that is slavery. And so we can see that in these opening verses of Psalm 2. Literally, we can see the United Nations, the international banking cartel, that is the rulers, the super rich, and the kings being the politicians, not the kings that are dynastic, that is by heritage rule, but the kings who assert themselves and are there not because they deserve to be, but because the people imagine a vain thing. The politicians and the super rich.
Now, J.R., the clock is catching up with us.
Yeah.
The next two verses, verses 4 and 5, tell the end of the matter. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision. Then shall he speak unto them in his wrath and vex them in his sore displeasure. We're not going to have time to fully expound this, but J.R., God is watching.
Yes, he is.
And at an appointed time, he is going to break forth.
In fact, you know, it says here, he'll have them in derision. He's going to have the last laugh. That word laugh right there is the term from which the colloquialism, the last laugh, came from. He's going to have the last laugh. He has them in confusion, derision. In fact, God's judgment is falling upon this earth, I think, as a result of the wickedness.
Right.
Let me give you just a quick example here. John McTernan, who's head of Cops for Christ, has suggested that God's judgment on America is because of the wickedness of America. And he goes on to talk about earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, fires, etc., and accelerating judgment of God because of an acceleration of wickedness in America. And perhaps in our next program we can get more into this, but it's really fascinating to see how that a lot of the things that America has suffered have been on the same day or during the same week following some wickedness.
He draws correlations between natural disasters and some very wicked events that have occurred in America recently. And I think on our next broadcast we'll quote a few of those. But J.R., the beautiful thing about this to me is that we've got hope. Verse 5 says, then he shall speak to them in his wrath. God is going to judge the people who have these marvelous plans for controlling the earth. This word then in verse 5 means suddenly. Suddenly shall he speak to them in his wrath. Just like that. When they think not.
Yeah. Suddenly. And this word vex, C.I. Scofield back many years ago said that's the Great Tribulation period. Wow.